So on January 6th, I was running errands in my car and I was listening to a local conservative talk show. And I was just learning about the Capitol break-in in Washington, D.C. Now, the host of the show was just ripping conservatives, Trump supporters, and Republican leadership over this break-in. And he had a lifelong conservative or Republican who had never been more ashamed to be a Republican. Now, just for the record, I denounce the people who were actually involved in the planning and execution of breaking into the Capitol building. But as I said, I was just learning about this break-in, and so I didn't really know very much. And still, my first thoughts were right on target. One, I knew that it was probably a small group completely unassociated with any kind of leadership in the Republican Party or the Trump administration. I knew that never would there be any kind of evidence presented that anybody in a leadership role was in any way involved in this. In other words, it was a rogue group. I knew that the media would still present it as Trump and all of his supporters and all conservatives and all Republicans, of course, were guilty of something. Finally, I knew that Trump supporters, Republicans, conservatives, everybody everywhere would uniformly denounce not just the behavior, but the group and groups and individuals who were involved. I wrote this right on my Facebook page shortly afterwards, and I was right. It was a small group. They were in no way associated with any leadership. Trump, Republican leaders, and everybody denounced not just the act, but those who committed the act immediately. And of course, the media did a full-on assault of Trump and his supporters and Republicans and Republican leaders. And of course, the break-in was an insurrection, not just a rogue group, even though that's all the evidence that was ever presented. Now, I know the media is claiming that he incited this by making false claims of fraud, but you know what? There are a lot of actual claims of fraud, and just because the media and Democrats want to assert that none of this was true, they never debunked anything. They never even investigated it. Now, I knew all of this because I've seen this movie before, literally probably hundreds of times. I don't even like the movie. It just keeps repeating over and over. It's the same plot and the same ending, and there's never any popcorn served. I don't get how a lifelong Republican and a conservative host are so disconnected from this reality. The events that happened don't show how bad Republicans and conservatives are. They contrast the difference between Democrats and Republicans and how they handle these things. Now, for the rest of this, when I say Republicans, I'm talking about Trump supporters and conservatives. And when I say Democrats, I'm talking about progressives, liberals, and of course the mainstream media. And this way I avoid all of the redundancy. If you've ever been a member of any kind of group, let's say a religious organization or a philanthropic group, at some point, especially as your group gets larger, you will have members that do bad things. When they do, unless your policies directly encouraged it, it says little about your group. What does say a lot about your group is how you handle it. Good organizations identify the issues rather than hiding from them. They address the bad behavior and denounce the act. And if it's egregious enough, they denounce the members who are involved. They make sure everybody knows it's bad, and then they move on. Republicans did that, and they always do that. All groups, especially large groups, have this issue. And it's because you all made the same mistake. You have humans as your members. You might get a better result if you had, say, a group of squirrels or llamas or tadpoles. As soon as you add humans into the mix, you're going to have these kinds of issues. What says a lot about the organization is how they deal with the issues. Now let's compare how Democrats handle these kinds of things. And remember, I'm including the media to avoid the redundancy. In May of 2020, George Floyd was essentially murdered by a police officer as other police officers stood by and watched. It was really a moment where all of America really could have and should have come together because we all agreed. Instead, BLM and Antifa decided to burn down buildings, including black-owned businesses, to destroy whole areas. They burned police cars. They attacked civilians and police. There were a lot of people hurt. There were 2 deaths. There were hundreds of arrests. And there was around $500 million worth of damage. So how did Democrats respond? Well, largely they made excuses. They told us how peaceful it was. And then the riots happened over and over and over for months in Democrat-controlled cities. Democrats, including our new Vice President Harris, did fundraisers to bail out those who were arrested. The people who were suspected of arson, looting, vandalism, violence, they were bailed out by Democrats. Local Democrat mayors and governors told police to stand down to allow rioters to do massive damage. When people wanted to protect their businesses, they were brutally attacked and sometimes killed, with little or no protection from police. Many of the people who were arrested for things like arson and violence were actually released with no charges by Democrat prosecutors. So did Democrats denounce the violence and the groups committing the violence? Nearly every time a Democrat was asked about this stuff, it was the same thing. We stand behind the protest and they're mostly peaceful. They even came up with a number for it. It was 93% mostly peaceful. Only 7% of those protesters were actually committing violence and burning down buildings and doing all the bad stuff. It does make you wonder how many of those Trump rally protesters actually were insurrectionists. Maybe it was 94% mostly peaceful. Oh wait, I'm sorry. Democrats insist it was definitely not mostly peaceful. This behavior is repeated over and over and over throughout the years. And a great example is going back to 2011 when under Scott Walker, thousands of protesters broke in to the Capitol building in Madison, Wisconsin for weeks. And this, of course, was not denounced by Democrats. It was championed. It was free speech. It was citizens voicing their concerns, their opinions. So my answer to the lifelong Republican who was embarrassed by a small rogue group, go join the Democrats. Apparently you'll be less embarrassed with them. And to the conservative host and to the Republican leaders who have decided to grab pitchforks to attack all of those who dared to question the election integrity, maybe you should stop and think of how proud you should be to be associated with the people who actually stand against violence repeatedly and predictably. If you find it embarrassing that a few Republicans went out and went rogue, maybe you should start a new group, and you could have squirrels and llamas and tadpoles. Get rid of those pesky humans because we all know they're nothing but trouble. Oh, are you sure you want to hit that like button? Could be a trick. Go ahead. And while you're at it, you might as well share it.